Hey everybody, my name is Ann Shafer and I'm an independent curator specializing in prints and printmaking. I'm joined on Platemark, Series 2 by True Ludwig, who is an artist, printmaker, and art historian. He is our leader on this journey in which we're presenting you a history of Western printmaking. We finally got into Rembrandt, which is really exciting. He's a critical figure in the history of Western prints. He's so important, in fact, that it took us 3 episodes to cover everything. The first episode, this one, will lay out Rembrandt and the milieu and tackle the landscape etchings. The second episode will tackle genre scenes, portraiture, and the one still life he made. And the third one will cover the religious etchings. Now, why is Rembrandt so important? Lots of artists will tell you that it's because he was so adept at etching. He really perfected it where people had not done so before. And what you get is the hand of the artist. In some of the religious prints, you'll see that he describes faces with maybe 3 or 4 lines, but you can just feel the emotion in those faces. And it just points to the autographic nature of etching, which means that you can really see the artist's hand as he or she is drawing on the copper plate, because they're able to drag a sharp stylus through a hard ground. So it acts a lot more like drawing than it does engraving, in which you're carving with a burin, which is really a hard thing. Rembrandt enjoys a reputation as the first and probably best etcher in history. And over the course of time since his life, there have been Rembrandt renaissances where artists take a good hard look at him again and again to learn from him because he's so good. He's that good. All right, buckle up. Here we go. Welcome to Platemark. This is Series 2, A History of Western Printmaking. We have reached Rembrandt, which is I'm here with True Ludwig, as always, and we're going to get rolling. Should we do our thing? We'll do our thing.
You do your thing.
I identify as a cishet white woman, and I use the pronouns she, her.
I identify as a gay white trans man, and I use the pronouns he, him.
We're recording this at the Purple Crayon Press in Baltimore, Maryland. All right, True. Rembrandt it's sort of...
Okay, so here is the thing.
I don't even get to start. All right, let's do it.
Well, all right, let's put this back in context to once upon a time, there was this really fabo associate curator named Ann Shafer, and there's this wackadoodle that was teaching history of prints at Micah. And we eventually got it up to 6 episodes that were done at the Baltimore Museum of Art.
In the print room.
And the students got to encounter the actual objects and be inches away from them. And it was so much fun bringing extra magnifying glasses and staging things so that there would be the ooh, or the unveiling, and I go, oh, or somebody go, that's just stupid. Because it was just overwhelming and quite thrilling.
Yeah, the big reveal.
First, you would have Dürer, who really set the standard and revolutionized everything that the printed image could do. And then it percolates along in the 16th century, and you have those that are working with the Catholic Church, or with and for, or maybe even against, after Martin Luther does what he does with his 95 Theses and spawns the thing that breaks the European continent apart. What I usually did at the beginning was my preamble. I would give the students a few things I wanted them to think about as we were looking at images that day. And I wanted them to keep in mind as we were going along who the client would be, who would be buying these images, and what would they be used for? Where would they be placed? Would it be in their own little private collection, or their Kunstkammer, their little art chest? And in the Renaissance, prints would be organized by subject. But by Rembrandt's time, they were organized by artist. So there was a quantum shift. Yeah, it became an issue after, for instance, Dürer and Lucas van Leyden, that you had artists of name and you would get those. So the other thing I would want the students to consider was, what is the intention or the subject matter of the image that they're looking at? Is it narrative? Is it propaganda? Is it still life or genre or portraiture or what have you? And to look at the quality of the drawing, meaning how is the drawing accomplished? Not as in this drawing is better than that drawing, but how each artist makes their own mark. And then I would ask them to look at the difference between autographic prints and reproductive prints. And would you remind us once again of what autographic prints are?
An autographic print would be one in which you can really see the hand of the artist creating the image, as opposed to a reproductive engraving, which had by that time become so formulaic as to be, well, not that anyone could do one, but that it was harder to distinguish the hand of the artist because it was so formulaic.
And indeed, the engraving might be replicating a drawing. It might be replicating a painting. It might even be replicating a drawing of a sculpture. It was a way of getting these paper museums around out in the world. And I honestly think we're probably going to need to do a pickup episode where we put together kind of a history of repro engraving, reproductive printmaking before we launch into the 18th century, because the reproductive print became such a tremendous force. You know, it was Goltzius who really had made it. Well, there's Hieronymus Koch in getting his stable of artists. And then Goltzius just revolutionized the concept of what engraving could be and set the stage. But there's a second revolution that blossoms with Rembrandt because he's using a different technique. The thing I'll have the students pay attention to also is when I talk about the quality of the drawing, it's also, is it an etched image or is it an engraved image? With etching, there's still a copper plate that's being used to carry the image. However, that copper plate would be covered with what we call hard ground. It would be a tar-like substance, which was an acid resist. And the artist could literally autographically, just like writing a drawing, they could draw easily and fluidly through that ground. And then the acid would do the work. And it's Rembrandt who really revolutionizes that technique and takes it to the next level. After Rembrandt, the world of prints would never be the same. There was a phenomenal revolutionary revitalization of Rembrandt's images in the 18th century, and people were collecting them like crazy. And then in the 1860s, there's another print renaissance, and this concept of having your prints look like Rembrandt's was, again, very important. Artists like James Abbott McNeill Whistler or Bracamond and all of these different 19th century artists were still emulating the caliber of the mark and the truth of the image that could be had in a Rembrandt etching, as opposed to the elegance and the staid beauty of the swell and the taper of the lines that would be made by someone like Goltzius. They're very different appearing things. And when you look at an engraving, the way the ink is pulled out of an engraved mark, it leaves a pyramidal ridge. It's a sharp line because there's a burin that goes straight through the metal, and it creates a very sharp ridge of ink. However, in etching, there's a more ragged, the acid will bite down into the plate, but it creates a much softer kind of a rounded top line. And it may seem like a small thing at this moment, but when you really start looking at the subtleties of how different etching can look from engraving, you've really come a long way. And then, of course, who's the client? Would it be those Protestants that the Reformation had set into play, or would it be the Counter-Reformation clients that were there to aggrandize the Catholic Church or to aggrandize the aristocracy? So we have this give and take, the difference between a kind of freedom that you will see with Rembrandt versus the kind of prescribed images and outright censorship of the kinds of images that could or could not be made for a Catholic country. So we have these dichotomies. If I were to set it up on a board, which I would do for the students, they would be able to see where the Protestant Reformation countries would be, which were all essentially going to end up be clustered right along the North Sea, and the Catholic Counter-Reformation countries of Italy, Spain, Flanders, which is essentially the same as Belgium today, and France. Those are the big, heavy-duty, aristocratic kinds of areas. That's what artists were still satisfying the need for church art. But when we talk about the Baroque in terms of the bourgeois, that's the group up in those Protestant countries, which is most of Germany, Switzerland, Holland, which is the Dutch Republic, by golly, and Scandinavia and sort of England. But the reason we're going to Rembrandt also is because we had set this up with Bruegel and Goltzius, and we've been talking about the Dutch independence and their finally winning out of the war of 80 years. I know.
It's
And
hard
just
to imagine. I
think
can't
it
even.
still just does the major flick of the
In
hair.
80 years, like that's more than anyone's. How could they even remember what started the dang thing?
The church.
Oh, right.
Just blame it on Luther or blame it on the Catholic Church because they had to have a counter Reformation. But here it is. There's this thing we're doing and nobody's going to back down, right? Eventually, with the Treaty of Westphalia, the Dutch Republic has its own way. Well, it's still a fascinating thing to realize how intensely different the art forms are going to be because the churches in Holland are going to be absolutely white-walled, simple, no ornamentation, except perhaps where your focus would be, which is on the pulpit. But just think of the interior of St. Peter's and you've got your basic Catholic idea. Very different art forms. That prescription of what imagery could be, well, there aren't going to be any graven images. So we'd already talked about how there are new kinds of landscape and genre scenes and portrait scenes. And now we even have architectural interiors. There are many, many, many interiors of Dutch churches being painted because it's a new and interesting thing to see these whitewashed walls. The utter simplicity of these very tiny Dutch people wandering around in these vast interiors in their very dark clothing, looking very serious. But these interiors bathed in a gorgeous, clean, clear light, images of people, of hardworking housewives engaged in their tasks of making lace or reading by an open window. These scenes, which to me, when I was in college, I finally went, oh, thank God, we're at stuff that I can relate to. It was a new kind of art making because it was for a completely different kind of a client. And if we think about how Holland had really essentially wrested itself from the sea, that's another victory against the sea, against nature, building dikes to keep the sea at bay, organizing canals and whatnot to continue to have more.
Well, the civic works, right?
Yeah,
It's crazy.
it's an amazing thing. So we just decided we would jump into Rembrandt and we'll backtrack with those other folks.
Okay, but before you do, can you use the word Baroque for the first time?
Well, okay.
Okay. What do you mean?
Well, the phrase is that the Baroque is the art of superlatives. What is a superlative, Miss Anne?
It's the most of something.
The biggest, brightest, bestest, loudest, strongest, brightest, most religious, over the top. It's the way of glorifying the church. When you have ceilings that
That's directly related to the church, right?
Absolutely.
Oh, okay.
Absolutely. Because with the Catholic Counter-Reformation Baroque art, they would expect theatrical-looking artwork. It might be ceiling paintings that make it look as though the top of the building has been blown off. It's big, dramatic motions and gigantic canvases, and it's sculptures that are spinning into 3 dimensions in the round. It's all kinds of activity and heightened emotion and really ecstatic moments and women that are being raped and
Ooh.
it's the Sabites. It's a real popular one. And it's given the pained look, but it's a really wonderful group of different kinds of sculptures.
But this is just supposed to get people to feel more strongly about the thing because it's more power.
Absolutely. So what we had discovered after Luther had begun his Reformation and said there will be no graven images, and that meant that the artists had to scramble and figure out what the heck they were going to make the art about, the Catholic Church gets its act together. And by about 1536, about the same year that Michelangelo is working on the Last Judgment on the altar wall of the Sistine Chapel, the Baroque Reformation, Counter-Reformation art program is really launched. It's the most marvelous kind of propaganda you can possibly imagine because you had all those people that are trying to leave the church. How do we lure them back? How do we get them completely invested, interested, and understanding that this is the big show? This is where God will live and that you want to be in our house because this is how we're going to do it. So the artwork would be phenomenally theatrical. It would have drama and wild emotional impact. And that way you, the viewer, are there. You are there in the moment. You can see angels flying through the ceiling. You can see things zooming out past your head from 3D sculptures. The sense of illusion and absolutely defying what the human eye could comprehend, whether is this real or is it part of the architecture, or is that an actual angel that's been sculpted to hang off the ceiling? Has this monk managed to paint a ceiling that looks like it's going all the way up 4 stories into the sky, or is it just a barrel vault? How are these artists able to make things that are more spectacular with a bunch of paint on a frescoed wall, just some slathered plaster and some paint, which is as good as, if not better than, any CGI computer generated stuff you'd see on a movie screen today. It's making you seem, with these dramatic stories that are being told, that you are there, you're a part of it, and the Catholic Church has got your back and you're going to be here and be a part of it. That's the Counter-Reformation Baroque. So those are the superlatives. But if we were to talk also about the superlatives of the Dutch, there's superlatives there as well, because things are smaller, they're quiet. And what I tend to tell students is that you have to listen harder when someone's not shouting, but when they're whispering. So you have the small, quiet voice of a print in your hands. You have the sermon, which you're focused on just the word. You have the kind of quiet interiority of being able to, the idea was to go into your house, to go into your closet and pray. That was what you were supposed to do. You could study those scriptures yourself, and you didn't need all of that other foo-foo-ra. I didn't even know this stuff existed until I think I was 19. I'd grown up in a Presbyterian church. I may have said this before, but when Mike Higgins' dad died, and the Higgins Coppola family were very much Catholic, I went to the first Catholic church I'd ever seen. And I looked around at all this dazzling stuff and gold and sculptures. And I'm like, why do the Catholics get all this cool stuff? I just had no idea. And it wasn't until I went to St. Olaf College, which is a part of the Lutheran Church, that I started to understand what that was about. So
The interesting thing to me is, okay, so I was raised Catholic until the age of probably 9.
I always forget that.
I know, maybe 10 on my mother's side. And at some point, she decided to take us to the Unitarian Church. And one of the Sunday school classes that I took at that point was comparative religions. And we went every week to a different service at a different church,
how cool
in a
is
different
that?
faith. It was totally cool.
How old were you?
10, 11?
Oh, how smart.
Somewhere in there. And the thing that didn't occur to me then, but now as I'm listening to you talk about this, is, as usual, the art is the thing that tells the history of the civilizations, and you can predict what the church messages will be by the architecture.
Mm-hmm.
It's fantastic.
Yep. And if you go driving through any community, still, any of this wonderful sweeping lines with lots of good-looking wood and serene walls, those are going to be Lutheran churches. And Methodist churches will all be bright and smiley, and they'll be very square. And then the Catholic church is going to have all the cool stuff. They get rose windows and they get all of that other stuff. That's an oversimplification. But
yes, but the money. Think about the money expended on these elaborate decorative schemes in these churches.
And who's in charge of spending the money? The very small 1 or 2%. You've got your clergy, you've got the Pope, you've got the Catholic Church, you've got archbishops, and you have the aristocracy. And none of the rest of y'all are any part of that. It's how do we get you back.
But the clergy is supposed to forsake earthly goods, right?
Sure.
And money and all that stuff. And that yet here's the richest, most powerful entity on the planet, the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, go ahead.
Welcome to lack of logic, but something that's completely workable, because not to denigrate, but there were 2 prongs to the Catholic Reformation. One was propaganda, and the other was penitence, shall we say? So that if you didn't comply, you would be drummed out. It could be punishment. So there was either propaganda or punishment. Are you going to be in front of the Spanish Inquisition?
Well, exactly. You get drummed out.
Correct.
And killed. Right.
Because that way you have some good, strong Catholics.
Small.
And but you're going to still see the same kind of thought process rolling around.
But and also the other fascinating thing is that we're still talking about religion.
Mm-hmm. Yes, we are.
And I don't know why that strikes me, but it's kind of crazy. Like the whole history of art, particularly in printmaking, it's completely intertwined in religion until,
of course,
starts of Rembrandt.
Well, yeah, except that Rembrandt could still be religious because he's making these small little parables that you could study at home. It's the Enlightenment where it really starts to fall apart, right? Because the science and fact-based inquiry is going to challenge the church, and certainly by the 19th century, you're going to have things like positivism and materialism and the fact that the church isn't as effective. It doesn't have the kind of pull that it once did. There's all kinds of different ways. It doesn't mean that people are maybe then any less religious. But if you look at what's going on now and you realize how many churches are closing or Catholic schools are closing, and you look at how things are being repurposed, and you realize that it was religion and religious freedom that built this country because people were escaping persecution. And now nobody knows the stories at all. And I'm going to say that with great certainty because I've been teaching this now for 31 years. And when I would ask, okay, which one of you guys knows the story of the prodigal son? At least 4 or 5 people would know what I was talking about.
Back then.
Or, back in 1991. Or even 15 years ago, perhaps. If I were to ask that question now, there might maybe be one person who went to a Catholic school and might know that story. And you yourself had told me that when they were little, your sons were looking at that guy on a cross.
It wasn't the cross. It was the manger.
Oh, okay.
It was hilarious. We were in a church for a Christmas concert. We had a friend who was playing that night at the church, so we went to see her play. After the concert, my husband was talking to her, and I took the kids over, and they were little. I went over to look at the creche, the manger, and there's the baby Jesus and, Mary and Joseph and whatever else.
And the ass.
Yeah, everybody else. I said to my oldest, Alex, I said, Alex, so we all know that's the baby Jesus. There he is, the baby. Who's this other guy? And he said to me in all seriousness, is that Hercules?
Right, because he's a big, strong dude who has a lot of power. It makes a whole lot more sense. And when I start the course now, I have to hand out this 2-page thing about what is the breakdown of the story from the incarnation to the resurrection, the whole passion of Christ, so that they'll know what these stories are when they see them. We are a group of cultural Christians who says, in God we trust, on our money. But the thought of what any of the actual meaning of this has really been lost, which is unfortunate because there's still so many great lessons that could be found in here. Having my students understand what is the passion story, why is that there? Or understanding that the Bible actually, after you get through all the begats in the beginning, gets saucy and fascinating. It is the greatest story ever told if you look at who slept with whom and die with me. Our little woman, and so, there are those kinds of stories that can really teach lessons that are still useful today. Well, at any rate, it didn't mean that the Dutch didn't believe in the Bible. Of course they did. In fact, they are reading something that's in their own dang language, and they can read it themselves. And to realize also that Amsterdam, Holland, was the most literate area then at this point on the planet.
There was a rise in people who were able to acquire enough wealth to be readers.
Exactly, because the Dutch had done an amazing thing in terms of what they had managed to do when they had broken away from the Spanish/Catholic Church. They managed to have a group of individuals in their Dutch Republic who they have the largest new thing called a middle class, the bourgeois. And when we say the bourgeois baroque, we're not saying it's bougie. We're saying this is a new class of individual merchants and scholars and people who have trades that make good money, and they are part of a city or a village that takes care of its own. And they are also wild about art. They're absolutely impassioned about art. I wanted to put that on your radar because when you think about how the Dutch had managed to win back their land from the sea with their dikes, and they had managed to create the largest, strongest fleet, if you will, aside from the Spanish up to that point, you have the Dutch East Indies Company. You have the Dutch exploring all across the world. It's cosmopolitan. It has got the highest trade base. If I remember correctly, after Bruges was silted over, I think it was the Antwerp harbor that had as many as 500 ships go in and out every day.
What?
Yeah.
How's that possible?
That's because the trade was so high up in that.
Gosh.
Yes. So that
not enough hours in the day to get 500 ships in and out.
But that's why the Dutch Golden Age occurred. Literally 500 ships at any one time in and out. But it was like the O'Hare of trade. And to me, that's really fascinating. And yet it doesn't mean that there weren't stiff penalties for those who didn't toe the line, who didn't behave properly. There were still going to be hangings of people that didn't, abide by the social contract. Because I'm actually showing Anne a little tiny print here of a gallows in the middle of a beautiful landscape, because that's a proof of what was happening to those who didn't behave. You still had to be a part, a contributing member of society. What I'm showing Anne right now is a slide I would show my students in the classroom, and it would show this little tiny area of Holland, the North Netherlands, the Dutch areas up on the North Sea, which would include Dordrecht and Leiden and Haarlem and Amsterdam and Utrecht and Breda, where the good cheese comes from, which is very close to the North Sea. And all of that trade in Amsterdam was also just insanely, it's right there in a harbor. It's brilliant. But what I'm showing Anne here is also the kinds of artwork that were generated. And we've talked about the new kinds of artwork, landscapes and still lives, which showed the beautiful possessions of this new middle class. These wouldn't just be like, I got some cool Richie Rich stuff. They would be still lives that were painted with such unbelievable verisimilitude. That's a whole branch of art making that the oil painters would do, Willem Kalf, and just a wild school of painters that could make crystal look like magic, and oranges that had pulp that you could squeeze right out of them, and plates full of oysters, which were delicious and also aphrodisiacs.
And maybe a fly.
A fly, or a small thing, or a memento mori, because what you would see were things that would remind you that life is short, don't get too vain, that you could enjoy the good things, but you should also be able to enjoy the fact that you were a person of God. There was always a warning in them. They were beautiful objects, and also beautiful, beautiful landscapes. And these painted things, such as those by Hobbema and Rustael, I'm showing Anne an image of
Rustael? Say that again.
Rustael.
I've never heard it said.
That's the way my Norwegian teacher said it.
No, I'm sure you're right. I always read it as Roysdale.
Well, sure. I always thought it was like the World War II, and it was the peasants, because that's the way I read those.
All right.
So this new concept of extolling the beauty of the land, which in this image that I'm showing to Anne right now, it's a little later than Rembrandt's day, but 1670, we're still in the same century, and it is a view of Haarlem from the dunes at Overveen. And I quickly wanted to point out to Anne, describe for your listeners, if you will, what you're seeing in this image.
Well, it's a beautiful, cloudy but sunny day, and Haarlem, of course, is super flat, so the landscape takes up about the bottom sixth of the composition, and the rest is this mass load of gorgeous clouds.
Yeah, because you're living on the North Sea, essentially. You'll notice this is a trope that Rembrandt probably really helped kick off, because I always tell my students that the folks living in Amsterdam are pretty much the most wonderful drip dry people in the world. Also the tallest and most beautiful. But it'll be sunny and gorgeous, and it'll rain, and then boop, it'll clear up. And literally, it'll do that 2 or 3 times a day. You're controlled by the climate. So this is a portrait of the clouds and the kind of weather that is happening, and the sea helps determine it. But there's other things happening here, as though the sun is breaking through some of those clouds and still shining down on the fields where crops are being sown and where the linen is being laid out to dry. And the one thing that's sticking straight up out of the middle of that image is the church. It is still the church. It is going to be bare as it can be on the inside. But the sense of the landscape for these folks that are so proud of their country and of their land is something that becomes tremendously popular for people who have art. And virtually every middle class home would have at least one picture in the room facing the street. We have a whole wonderful passage about how important art was to this new middle class, because they had money to spend on it and they're fascinated by it, and it needed to tell them stories. And one of the best storytellers, of course, was Rembrandt. How do we do that? How do we have this artist who his country has been coming out from under Spanish rule, and they're now essentially reveling in they don't become fully free until 1648, but they're reveling in their new way of living. They're in charge of their own fate. One of the people that does the best job ever of chronicling that is Rembrandt. And one of the things he does better than I think almost anybody this study that said that he would voraciously sketch constantly. He was always sketching. He's the kind of student that you would want in your visual journalism class. And he'd take a look and he'd want to see these different morphotypes and how someone's hunched over, or what is the body's language when it's in grief, or when it's in joy, or when it's fainted, or when it's in abject misery, when it has absolutely no self-respect whatsoever, or when it's a triumphant being. He understood all of those modes of how to depict human beings, not just mannequins, but actual individuals who had a psychology. Somehow he could get into the psychology of his sitters too. And some writers have said there's nothing more expressive than the corners of the eyes and the corners of the mouth. And man, Rembrandt, he could get it with painting, and he could get it in the etching plate. And it's just baffling to me how,
3 lines or something.
yeah, truly, truly 3 lines. He's pretty much a Protestant. He's telling those Protestant tales, but he chose, when he finally got his best house, it was in the Jewish section of the city, because he loved looking at the faces of the Jewish people, their expressions and their coloring, and he was a tremendously cosmopolitan individual. He just reveled in the human drama of life, and he could create those stories by how he could analyze housewives or small children or men of the city or guilds, or there's no aristocracy. It's mayors, it's people on town councils, it's just regular folk. And it's the first time any of those folks had really been depicted. And it's the solid, matter of fact, no airs kind of imagery that Rembrandt helps us have. First, let's just talk about some of the more day-to-day things that these Dutch folk are enjoying now that they've managed to get out from under Spanish or church rule, Catholic rule. They're very, very proud of themselves. And these folks are used now to they want to see some things that make sense to them. There's maritime trade, so you will see some ship scenes. You realize that there's only one marine scene that Rembrandt ever painted, and it was stolen from the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum.
Right.
It's never been found.
No, it has
There's
not.
one, and I think they're on the Sea of Galilee. Yeah, so it's still biblical. Ha! Nevertheless, everyday life is what is supposed to be the mode of living. Here is a wonderful thing that had been written by somebody in 1640. His name was Peter Mundy, an English traveler. He wrote, "As for the art of painting and the affection of the people of pictures, I think none other go beyond them, there having been in this country many excellent men in that faculty, some at present, as Rembrandt, etc., all in general striving to adorn their houses, especially the outer or street room, with costly pieces. Butchers and bakers, not much inferior in their shops, which are fairly set forth, yea, many times blacksmiths, cobblers, etc., will have some picture or other by their forge, and in their stall. Such is the general notion, inclination, and delight that these cunning natives have to paintings." Your butchers and your bakers and your cobblers have a picture up.
Huh.
That to me is amazing. So the taste for art that was stimulated by this culture is quite wonderful. There's no church patronage. Artists have to compete. They have to figure out what to make. Patrons want paintings of themselves and some of their successes, their country, their home, and everything about the market for images that the cobbler and the baker could afford. Well, prints would be a really smart way to do that, wouldn't it? And they'd want to see themselves. Or, let's say, copies after other paintings, but certainly Rembrandt didn't have to do that because he was the consummate storyteller. And what he drew and then etched would have to be marketable to a buying public. But what he does to make those images different or more exciting than the rest is what's, to me, the astonishing thing he did for this new middle class that wanted images, images, images. So we were going to talk about his painting, which he was doing all at the same time. It fascinates me that in his life, Rembrandt probably made upwards of 300 etchings, of which we had 280. We counted them up one day, 280 at the Baltimore Museum of Art. And that's really something.
It's a lot.
If you think about all the Rembrandt kinds of paintings that you would see, because he had never been outside of Holland. He never went to Italy, but he loved looking at the work of artists who had been there. And he also was he's magpie. He had costumes and wonderful, beautiful fabrics and art objects, and he had prints. He owned prints by some of the Spanish artists, etchings by the Spanish artists. He owned by the Italians. He owned engravings by Lucas van Leyden and Dürer. And he also owned those etchings that looked like engravings by this guy named Callot, which we'll talk about him in a subsequent episode. He predates Rembrandt, but he's in a different part of the world. But the fact that
think of him as after, because we always did him after.
I know, but he's actually
my chronology's all screwed up.
Well, but it's not, because, well, we'll get to it. It's pretty interesting to think about how he's really aware, very aware of the great new things, even through the artwork that's being made in the Flemish regions, where they're all still like, holy crap, there's this guy named Caravaggio, and he's making these images with incredible drama, this light and the dark. And you can pick any Caravaggio painting you want to show your listeners, and it could be, it really, let's do the conversion of St. Paul. Okay. Things that are in your space, in your face, and they're like, I believe I'm changed. They're astonishing. But Rembrandt loved the drama that he saw in those kinds of paintings. And he loved the kind of color that the Venetians would have used. And he liked the physicality of the kinds of figures that Rubens would be using. And here's the other thing that's really interesting. You got to think of those boys, Rubens and Rembrandt, side by side. I try to teach things where you've got, so Rubens is your Catholic Counter-Reformation guy, and Rembrandt is your Protestant guy. And then we could take that further back and we could talk about Titian versus Leonardo da Vinci. And then we could move it forward and we could talk about Matisse versus Picasso. One is more formal and one is more emotional. You could do it all the way to the present, well, let's say to the 60s, and you could say it's Rauschenberg and Jasper Johns, that there's always a wonderful way to play them off of each other. Well, you'll see in his work that Rembrandt was paying attention to Rubens, and yet his images will have a quiet notion to them that have a sense of change and flux in a really tremendous way. I want for you to think about this fellow who was the 9th of 10 children, coming from this little milling town, which was now coming up in stature, Leiden. Rembrandt van Rijn was from Leiden. Rhine River, yes, flows through Leiden, and it's the same Leiden that Lucas van Leyden lived in. It's the same place. Dürer had gone up there 100 years earlier. So it's an interesting town. It had a university. Rembrandt enrolled in that university and he never went. The idea of Rembrandt starting to etch and starting to paint in 1628, 1630s, he's doing that. And then he's had this 3-year apprenticeship with a Leiden artist. And then he has a 6-month apprenticeship with an Amsterdam artist. And I think about this like you go on your semester abroad, right? And he goes from Leiden to the big city of Amsterdam, which is up and coming. I mean, it's just growing like leaps and bounds between like 1630 and 1660. It's just literally the golden age. They're so wealthy. The highest per capita income in Europe is in that area. Here's Rembrandt, who's going to revolutionize things in etching, this new technique that he pretty much perfects as to what Dürer did in engraving. And he is so smart that he's going to figure out how to create images that will sell. If you think about the images that I've tried to pick out for you today and to savor, he figured out a variety of inks. He figured out his acid strengths and what works best and how long. And eventually he got to the point where you can't tell how many times that plate's been dipped in the acid. It's so seamless. He had many different kinds of wiping techniques. So he wouldn't wipe images all tight down to the plate. He would actually make a painterly print. He'd use the ink as a painting source on it. He was just so facile. It's really hard to tell in some respects how he made the damn thing. And then by 1640, this Japan paper comes into Amsterdam from Japan, and it's a whole different kind of paper. And he's experimenting with that too.
There is a version of the 3 crosses at the National Gallery on vellum.
Yes, there is, because vellum, when it gets wet, vellum, parchment, it doesn't absorb ink as well. So the ink sits right on the surface, and it's like this very delicate but astonishing little black mountainscape of sexy ink. Yeah, it's
worth looking at.
No, it's a killer diller thing. So in 1632, Rembrandt's just about time to move to the big city, and the 2 things that he makes to introduce himself to the people of Amsterdam, saying, "I've arrived," One is a painting that I think virtually anybody that's interested in art would know, and it's the anatomy lesson of Dr. Tulp, who was painted in 1632. And just tell the winners what they're seeing.
Well, it's a doctor performing a dissection for another group of doctors, I assume,
Correct.
which was fairly unusual and probably until then illegal.
And their costume, man. Tell them about what
Yeah, they have ruffs, no, collars.
Yeah.
Yeah, those are ruffs.
Ruffs, collars, yeah.
Big rough collars and black robes. I mean, they look very academic and just so.
They're wearing still that very sedate apparel that is expected by the Spanish, that severity of dress. And that is a holdover from the Spanish.
Oh, interesting.
However, these academics, these surgeons, are all gathered around Dr. Tulp, who's got essentially the use of light on this is absurdly
Caravaggesque.
It is absolutely Caravaggesque. Rembrandt has foreshortened the cadaver of someone who had broken the social code. He's being used for an anatomy lesson, and Dr. Tulp has opened up the lower arm, and they're looking at the various tendons, which are painted with unbelievable verisimilitude. And the expressions on these surgeons is amazing. Their shock and awe and amazement at what's happening. And Dr. Tulp is lecturing in such a precise way, and someone else is busily taking notes. If you look at that, it looks very instantaneous. It was a commission by the Surgeons Guild. And what that is Rembrandt showing off, because up to this point, all of these kinds of what we call corporation pictures, pictures of a group of guys, like the guys that are of the Gun Guild or the guys that are the Drapers Guild or whatever group of guys, it always ended up looking like a first grade school picture. You know, people lined up and Rembrandt breaks that rule right off the bat. And he arranges them as though they're clustered around a very specific activity, which is absolutely fascinating. What it is that they do. It is lit in an amazing and unusual way. He brings that lighting and that shock and awe and amazement that it's really cinematic, if you think about it, to his religious or any other images. And the only reason I'm showing this religious image right here is because this is a scene of the raising of Lazarus. And he did it the same year as the anatomy lesson of Dr. Tulp. This is his opening salvo of a print to say to Amsterdam, "I'm here." And it's an amazing large-scale print, and it's dramatic in the extreme. And you see Lazarus standing in the center with his hand raised, and all the light from outside and all the dark is behind Christ. And he's essentially commanding this corpse of Lazarus to rise from the dead. It's even in a kind of a, what do you think, a Hollywood bowl kind of shape, if you will. The drama of this, unlike anything that has been seen. I think about the hubris of this guy. Because at this point, he's 26.
Oh.
Right? He's been born in 1606. He dies in 1669. So here's this strapping lad who's going to show these guys, I'm the new kid in town, and I'm all that in a bag of chips. So that's his opening salvo, to let folks know he's here. He's got his eye on this dude named Rubens and what Rubens was doing in terms of things like his phenomenally huge religious paintings.
Rubens is in Antwerp, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, he's in Antwerp. That's where his home is. He speaks 8 languages. He works for 3 different kings. He's on aristocratic and ambassador missions. He delivers military secrets. He's quite the guy.
Huh.
I needed to read on him even deeper. He was an international star, to be sure.
Huh.
And Rubens at the same time is doing paintings that are, well, he's doing Catholic kind of Reformation paintings, such as this removal from the cross, which is 15 feet tall.
What?
Yeah. It's an altarpiece in a church, right? And then he says, I want people to know who I am. And he eventually finds the perfect engraver, which was Lucas Voorsterman. And that's a whole nother story.
Oh, Voorsterman. Right.
Yeah, who has to figure out how to take 15-foot painting in all of these colors and shrink it all down into this wonderful engraving, this reproductive print, with privilege, cum privilege, with a copyright, which is something that Rubens was figuring out how to use. And Rembrandt's going, okay, is that how we do that? Oh, okay. And he's keeping his eye on that. So that is something to consider, because Rembrandt had done his version of a deposition.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
And that's done, let's see, what are we talking, 1633? And then he does an etching of that in 1633. Look at this, though. I'm pairing 15-foot painting to a painting that Rembrandt has done, which is maybe 24 inches tall, and he turns into an etching.
Oh, wait. His Rembrandt's painting is 24. It's small.
It's little because
It's domestic.
he's in Dutchland. So he's using the language of the
see.
Bible, but realizing that when there is religious art made, it is for study and for use in the home.
It doesn't have to be yelling at you from the.
It's not. It's whispering.
Quiet.
Yes, it's
Yeah.
quiet and it's whispering. He's figuring out how to market himself very shrewdly from the things that Rubens has been doing. And yet, here's stuff that Rubens won't do. Rembrandt also knows what's going to sell better.
The print.
Yeah, and you can sell a whole mess of those things.
But so is the print basically the same size as the painting?
Pretty much.
Pretty much. But why wouldn't he reverse the etching so that it matches the painting?
Rubens didn't have Worsterman do that.
I see.
Because when you're making the engraving, you want to match it precisely to what the painting was. So it doesn't reverse until it's printed. They're like mirror images of each other.
Right.
Yeah. So, it's just fascinating to me to think about this kid like, okay, that's how the guy is playing the big leagues. Hey, let's see what it's in. And he figures it out. And then I asked the students, like, okay, we know that Vorsterman engraved this fabulous image of Rubens' Descent from the Cross. We know that's a reproductive print. Then I say, okay, so Rembrandt has made a beautiful etching of his own painting. So what's that?
Well, we talked about that with Barocci too.
Yeah.
Right.
So is he autographically reproductive is my question. And then it's just being annoying because who wants to say that?
Well,
But it is because it's autographic. And if we take a look at how he's learning to use etching and understanding how to have that scribe dance across the plate, and he realizes all of the different kinds of things that are available to him to make images of, then we're going to see him doing genre scenes and landscapes and so on and so forth. So I wanted for us to talk about his non-religious or his secular images for the start. And I have pulled a couple of really nice images. This sort of replicates what we would have pulled out, what you would have pulled out for the students. And here I'm showing Anne a view of Amsterdam from the Northwest, and it was done in 1640. Rembrandt started doing his landscapes about 1640, 1650. He did 26 landscapes, which I think is quite wonderful. And already we're in a new area because it's all etching, completely etched. What do you see? Tell me. Why is it important to him to do this image of Amsterdam?
That's a great question. Okay, so this is the view of Amsterdam from the northwest, dated circa 1640, and it is about 5 by 6 inches, so not very large. Now, that makes me immediately suspect that he went out into the landscape to make it.
Absolutely. Or at least get it started in the landscape, get it scribed on the plate, get the rudimentary information on there, give it a first bite, and then he could go back in and do another set of etching on top of that so that you would get all of the foreground things that are darker. But I want for you to notice he's given us the landmarks, some landmarks
of the city.
Amsterdam. We have two very important church steeples.
And we have a bunch of windmills. But again, the landscape is so flat that you end up with 2/3 of the image being sky.
Correct.
With no clouds in this case, which is really remarkable.
And that's interesting because it's his first landscape, right? So he's like, what do I do next? So it's really fun to start seeing how he samples and does different kinds of things. Very shortly thereafter, he does an image of the windmill, and this is done in 1641. And he already is becoming more and more experimental. He starts using different ways to activate the sky. And it's actually, if you get up really close, in certain places, you can zoom right into it, and there's a craquelure on there. He used something called sulfur tint, which is a way of getting some very breathy kinds of atmospheric things there. And he thought, well, he didn't like it because it was too uncontrollable. So he was testing. But
do we know how that's actually done?
I've never bothered to try.
I know, me neither.
I have a sense that it's similar to spit bite.
Spit bite, okay.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll look it up.
But here, tell me about what strikes you as interesting or unique about this particular image. Anything?
Well, yeah. So in this one, this is also a landscape, but we're much closer up to a structure, being the windmill, which is smack on the left. But we're looking at the windmill from the back side, which is sort of interesting. And then there's a mill house next to it. And the whole composition drops from the upper left down to the lower right. You have a triangle of plain sky.
It's a yin yang. It's literally just divided. If you think about it, all of the architectural forms that are closest to us are immediately in the front. To me, that's saying, ooh, Titian, Titian. It's like doing that same diagonal thing. And then if you look in the way distant, there it is. There's that flat land. You can see the windmills.
Just little tiny windmills. Yeah.
Very,
well, it's atmospheric perspective.
Indeed. And wait a minute. He got atmospheric perspective in an etched landscape. That's just it. That's just not fair.
Well, that's multiple bites in the acid.
Of course it is.
Right.
But he also has a certain way of understanding how strong to make the acid, how to control it more.
No, he gets it for sure.
And he's printing his own stuff. And that's the other part that makes me so happy, because that's how he really does get so many of these interesting effects. So this is the one that I get so excited about.
Well,
and so does Anne, because it was always in a frame when you would bring it out from storage, and it is the Three Trees.
Yes.
And the Three Trees, done in 1643, is his most ambitious landscape. And I would say to you that it's like the landscape 100 Gilded print.
Yes.
Now, it's a good size.
Yeah, it's bigger than that other one.
Oh, yeah. Much, much, much. Now, you think those other ones were like ownable. You could almost like a 5 by 6 inch landscape. But the Three Trees is a good bit larger. It is, the plate is 8.5 inches by 11 inches. Hey, it's the size of a piece of printer paper.
There you go.
Ha, ha.
Aha.
That's still a big copper plate. Now, that's a big copper plate, but it has so much more going on in it than we did in the Windmill or in the View of Amsterdam, which had aerial perspective. Rembrandt always gives us a very interesting and not always expected viewpoint. Here we are in the Three Trees. We're looking at Three Trees. Oh, Anne, just tell them what they're seeing.
The Three Trees is remarkable in terms of the timeline of these landscapes because he's incorporating weather for the first time.
That is a tremendous focus of it.
Yes, because you have a rather serious rainfall coming in from the upper left corner, which,
huge sweeping diagonal lines.
But it doesn't seem to be affecting any of the people who they're hard to find, but they are in there. There's a little man at the lower left doing something, and then there's an artist up on the upper embankment on the right.
It's kind of almost at the golden mean spot, and an inch over from there is tiny little lumpin.
Little guy.
That is probably a guy very much like Rembrandt, sitting out in nature, sketching onto a grounded plate, a view from one of the few high points of land.
I was just going to say, and there's this kind of this high point, which is odd and unusual. And the Three Trees they're like one unit. They're not like three trees scattered across a thing. They're a thing.
Yeah, they're 1, 2, 3 in order, and they are oak trees, and they're strong, big, robust oak trees. They almost sort of look like broccoli.
They do have a little
really leafy quality to them. In the foreground, we have the same diagonal that we saw on the Windmill, but then we have other things coming in, like the rain is literally coming in from the left. It has not affected the sunlight coming through the clouds and dappling the fields where the people are laying out their various crops and doing their daily chores. And the swirling, beautiful sense of atmosphere and flux. It's just stunning. And it's done with nothing but.
Right, no tone.
No tone, just line, 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 line. There are those that would say, well, you can find these various things in there. Anne has pointed out to you the artist sketching on the hill at the right. There's apparently a Fisher couple at lower left.
Honka.
Yeah, there's a pair of people, an amorous couple hidden in the darkened foreground bushes. This is why you would come up and look at my etchings, because it goes beyond rewarding scrutiny, just because it's nature rendered in the most exquisite way possible.
It is beautiful. And I'm sure you're about to say that it illustrates the idea of changeable weather in Holland.
Well, yeah.
Right.
And it's only, 30 years earlier than Ruysdael.
Right.
Because he's doing this not in paint. And he didn't paint these kinds of landscapes. He only etched them.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. He varied the wiping, and he would vary the inking and use different kinds of papers for sure. He used etching. In some places, he would use the Buren and engrave to get some darker values a little bit. Used plenty of dry point all the time. So he is making landscape into something you could really expect. And again, sketches almost without a doubt done on site. And the humans are minuscule. And the nature is enormous. 2/3 of this is sky. There's even a wedge of geese that are flying through there. All these lovely little touches. And you wonder, why does it look like it's in flux like that? And then I look at Anne and I say, well, Anne, why do you think it look like it's in flux like that?
Well, in the center part of the sky on the left half, there's this strange formation of cloud, which many people believe, and I think has been proven, but I'm not sure. There was an original composition started on this plate that he abandoned, and it's a figure in the vertical orientation.
But yeah, but it's a plate that's been reused.
Right.
And maybe he would have burnished that out a little bit, but he has allowed it to become part of that swirling sky. I just adore that sense of repurposing. We have this huge panorama. It is an amazing panorama. And off there in the back left, about to get hit by that rainstorm, is a city view. But it's because it's city dwellers that buy those prints, so why not do that? But then we have the fact that it is called the Three Trees. So, why?
Many people liken it to the Trinity from the church.
Exactly right. You didn't have to say, here's a crucifixion. You could say it because oak trees are these moral emblems of strength and faithful fortitude. And here they are on the hill. Well, let's say it's a hillock. And it's interesting that the artist is literally contemplating those three trees, these three crosses, if you will. And it's an astonishing foray into a new world of image making that our friend Rembrandt has done.
Well, and if you ever had to have only one Rembrandt, this one touches just about every last thing that he's trying to say.
Without question.
Right.
I mean, it's all there on every possible value, and the weather, the life, the fact that humans are minuscule in a vast landscape that is still part of God's great creation. There's a thankfulness and a reverence to what nature is here. It's hard to believe that was drawn. To me, it just feels like it's always been there.
And to me, also, the rain clouds that are jutting down the corner here feel like they're like the foreground scrim on a stage. It's going to hit this little stand of trees and the people, but not hit the city behind. Like,
Yeah.
It's not a huge, expansive rain. It's just sort of a scrim on the front.
And then it's going to pass by, and you've seen those. Yeah.
Did I ever tell you my stepmom had a dog when her kids were little named Drip Dry?
No.
I always thought of him as a Dutch dog.
He pretty much sounds like that. Actually, one of my sources said, Drip Dry, that someone has written that there was an abandoned sketch of the death of the Virgin, but I don't know. It's in there. I think you all need to spend some time because there's so many good zooms online that you can play with that. Rembrandt can give you such amazing simplicity. There's things like, well, you have the three tree, which is maximalist. I'm showing Anne now Six's bridge, and Jan Six and his family were friends of Rembrandt's. And it's literally it's a simple bridge over a canal. There's a sailboat on the canal. There's a tree. It's just as simple as it can be. And yet it's just, well, what do we think of that, Anne?
Well, it looks like a single hit. I'm in the landscape. I'm going to scrap that tree in there because it's really quite sketchy and not much substance there. I mean, it just looks like a one hit.
There's a little church back there. And yet it's like, how is it that he can make something that is so simple and he can get it said, and it is almost like a cartoon. It's like an abstract of the landscape. One of the things that Anne will remember is that the final project for the students in History of Prints was they had to replicate an image or alter it in some way, but it had to be done at exactly the same scale. It had to be a copy of the image. And I do remember her name was Jen something, and she did a restatement of this called Howard's Bridge.
Right.
The Howard Avenue Bridge runs right through the heart of Maryland Institute. So it's incredibly smart, very clever. It's fun for me to see how the students have to grapple with what it takes to get that in there. I wanted to wheel through one other really fascinating one, which comes late. Rembrandt has these two flurries of landscape output in the middle of the 1640s and also in the 1650s. The Goldwares field is really a gorgeous, long panorama.
Yeah, I'm not sure I've ever seen this one.
It's stunning. It was done in 1651. The Goldwares field is also the estate of the tax receiver. And here you see the white of the paper has been left, and then you can see in this particular impression that he's wiped it in a certain way so that the sky has a certain kind of presence. And you know for a fact that he would have changed that. Now, this is a view of Haarlem, which is maybe 30 miles to the west of Amsterdam. And it is an actual landscape that he probably sat there and sketched. The other thing I wanted to share with you, it was a commission. He did this to pay off debts to whom, in 1651, he's still paying off debts for a house that he bought in 1633. Rembrandt always had terrible financial problems.
Not a great businessman.
Wretched. And he'd bought this lavish house, which is now the Rembrandt Museum. It's so gorgeous. In 1633, and he was supposed to pay a certain amount of money. Never did it right. It had gone up, it had quadrupled. He's trying to do these landscapes and sell off prints to make it happen. And here we have the linen bleaching fields. It'll be something that'll really interest people and get them to buy it. And Anne is pointing to something in the lower left corner. What are you going to tell me about that?
Oh, no, I'm just, well, we know that he used etching, and we also know he used dry point. And in this particular image from the British Museum, the dry point burr is really quite present, which is great. You can see what they call the feathery lines,
yeah,
that sort of bloom of ink.
And Rembrandt loved that. You'd get maybe 10, maybe 15 prints before that would all wear down, and then he'd just go back in there and rip it up. He totally would do that. We have this way of sucking us into a view and getting us to be a part of this activity.
I could own that one.
Oh, heck yeah. And what Pierre McGowan did an incredible, he'd never etched before, and he did a beautiful version of that.
Right. Good job, Piero.
Yeah. And then I just thought I'd give you one of the other things that he would do. We have the landscape concept and we have genre. He did one still life.
What?
One. Let me just show you the one thing that he ever did. I imagine it's because it wasn't interesting enough.
Goodness.
It's a gorgeous image of a shell. Of a Canis marmoreus. It's a beautiful spiral-shaped shell. It's lovely, isn't it?
It is beautiful.
It could have been done by anybody.
Yeah. That's so weird because it's very...
It's descriptive. He's on the job. He's rendered it. It doesn't have anything to zip up his thinking at all.
That's so weird.
And for a storyteller, it doesn't have a story unless something crawled out of it. Isn't it funny to see him just do that one? That's like the only thing he ever did.
It is funny. This one still life, rando.
It couldn't possibly have been that interesting to him. He did it in 1632. Yeah, he's like, okay, I'm done.
Maybe it was as something easy to sell and make.
But at the same time, why would he do that if he could have all of these various trappings in other images?
Right.
Why bother?
Okay, so we're going to wrap up the landscape.
The thing that I realized by looking at Rembrandt was that here's a person who truly loves his homeland, never left it, has taken great pains to really observe it carefully and look at it as the spontaneous activity of nature in ways I don't think we've ever seen landscape depicted this spontaneously, this easily. There's an ease about it. There's a freshness about it. Even when it's done with a very few strokes, it's unbelievably complete. And I think we've been able to see with these images that he'll be able to use that environment that he looks and observes so carefully, like that little guy on the hill looking at the three trees, that he'll be able to use that kind of an environment to populate that with people that he's observed with the same amount of care. Where the one piece of nature, the still life that we just spoke about, that's not going to hold his interest. It doesn't have the corners of the eyes and the corners of the mouth and the different kinds of activity, the busyness of human life. And we'll see that in the next chunk. And see Rembrandt experiment with genre scenes and with portraiture, which he revolutionizes as well.
All right. Awesome. Thanks, Drew. So stay tuned for part 2.
Okay, that was part 1 of 3 parts covering Rembrandt van Rijn, the amazing etcher from Amsterdam. Next time, we will cover the genre scenes and portraiture. And then the third one will be on religion, and we will move on from there. Thanks as always to True for his incredible energy and passion for the subject. It's unmatched. And also a thank you to Michael Diamond for the use of his original music. The images that we talk about are over on the show notes at platemarkpodcast.com. I hope you guys are taking advantage of that. And let's see, is that it? I guess it is. We'll see you next time.